All right, hey everyone. I'm Tom Dale. This is Yehuda Katz. We are together the creators of Ember.js, or sometimes known Dr. Evil and Mini-Me. So we've given a couple talks before about our tagline. The tagline for Ember is a framework for building ambitious web applications. And Yehuda and I have given a couple talks before about what it means to be a web application, and we've given a few talks about what it means to be an ambitious web application, but we realized we've never really unpacked the term framework. And I think that many elements of the JavaScript community consider framework to be a dirty word. In a lot of ways, the term is so toxic that we look at the landscape of tools that you can use in JavaScript land, and people do insane contortions. Sometimes I feel like I'm at Cirque du Soleil with the contortions people are doing to not be a framework.
Yeah, I definitely promise I am not a framework. So today, what we want to do is talk about, we want to issue a defense of frameworks. Not only do we think that frameworks are a good idea, and people should like them more than they like them, but we are actually very proud to be a framework. So one place that people often start when they talk about libraries and frameworks is they use this kind of terminology. The difference between a library and a framework is that you call a library, but a framework calls you. And we want to start this by crossing this off and saying, this is really a particularly glib way of talking about libraries and frameworks that tells you nothing about the benefits of a framework, what the trade-offs are, when you might use a framework versus a library, and anything like that. So we want to start by saying, if this is the primary frame that you use to think about libraries and frameworks, please stop doing that. We are going to give you a better way to think about it. So interestingly, Ember and Angular actually give us a pretty good window into the real difference between what a library is versus what a framework is. Ember is an unabashed framework for ambitious applications. We say that we're a framework for ambitious applications. But Angular is actually very proud of the fact that it's a tool set for building a framework. It's a tool set that you use to build your own framework, and not actually a framework itself. And so we think that this is actually going to give us a good opportunity to look at what the difference is between a library or a tool set on the one hand and a framework on the other hand.
So one complaint that we hear frequently when people get started with Ember, especially people who are brand new to writing like client-side JavaScript, they say, you know, Ember seems like a good idea, but it really doesn't feel like it's flexible enough. It especially doesn't feel flexible compared to libraries. Like, it doesn't feel flexible compared to Backbone or Angular. But what is flexibility? That's like a very, very vague term. So maybe we can best illustrate what people usually mean when they say flexibility by looking at an example. And I think one core feature of both Angular and Ember is this feature called dependency injection. So dependency injection, basically what it lets you do is you write a bunch of classes, and then instead of you creating all the instances and wiring all those objects together, the system does it for you. So you give it all the classes, and it will basically wire everything up for you. And I was reading the Angular documentation last night, and there was a snippet of the documentation that said, in order to understand Angular, you have to understand dependency injection. It's a really core feature of the framework. And dependency injection is actually a core feature of Ember as well, although I think many people don't think of it as a core feature in the same way they do with Angular. But I think describing how these two features in the two tools works really helps illustrate the difference between a framework and a toolkit for building your own framework. So Angular's dependency injection is really flexible. It's really flexible in the sense that the way that you do it is you just list all of your dependencies. So in this example, we have a controller called myController, and it's got access to the scope, and then it says, give me access to dep1, dep2, and then those get passed into the function. So it lets you inject anything into anything else. But there's really no hint about whether the object that you're asking to be injected should be used by the object requesting it. So this is actually really flexible, because there's only one dependency injection primitive that you need to learn. And once you've learned that one primitive, boom, if you need access from one object in another, it's really easy to do, and you know how to do it. And I think that, frankly, I'll confess that that makes Angular's dependency injection system much easier to use.
Now, I think it's important to note that, in general, Angular is really optimized for a public API overall, not just for dependency injection, that is maximally flexible. So every single time you look at an Angular API, you can tell that they put a lot of effort into making sure that the way the public API is used is maximally flexible. There's always public knobs and whistles that you can turn on any public API that you look at that helps you to tweak, to move, to do something that's more flexible than just the way that the main path that most people end up taking.
So my opinion is that if you're a framework, and notice the toolkit for building frameworks, one thing that's really important to do is to build in guidance on top of those maximally flexible primitives that gives you the power that you want, the expressiveness that you want, but it kind of gently nudges you towards making decisions that will make you happiest in the long term. So the notion of building a toolkit that you can use to build your own framework, it sounds really appealing. Because one thing I hear a lot is like, well, you know, every application is so different. Everything that I'm working on is really, really domain specific. And probably if I use an off-the-shelf framework, you know, maybe I'll only use 20 or 30% of it. And that seems like a lot of bloat that I'm having to pay for. You know, doesn't everyone know that these applications are so different that you need all the flexibility that you can get? And as we saw, Ember's routes don't have access to views, right? So in this example, you're a route object. You're responsible for creating the model. You don't have access to the views. And getting access to those views is quite painful. So don't you need that flexibility?
So in order to answer this question, I want to make just a few observations, a few basic observations that I think we can all agree are true. And the first observation is that basically everybody who ends up building a bunch of apps, if you're a person who's built 5 apps, you probably have a little framework that you tote around that becomes the thing that you start your next project with. Certainly every big consulting shop does this. And these frameworks that people tote around are not domain specific. They're not, this is the framework that I use when I build X versus this is the framework that I use when I build Y. They're really general purpose frameworks that end up getting built just because you've built so many apps and you've noticed some comparisons, some things that are similarities. The second observation is that often we'll try to show people, we'll make some examples and we'll say, it's really easy to use Angular's dependency injection wrong. For example, let me make a filter and I inject route params. And basically what every Angular developer tells us, you're just doing it wrong. That's obviously wrong. So Angular developers and Backbone developers who are experienced actually have a list of things that if they look at it, they can say, that's just wrong. You're doing it wrong. And then there's another list of things that's like, this is the right way to do it. And sort of a more general observation is that every single library and toolkit that is going for maximum flexibility ends up creating a cottage industry of best practice guides on the internet that help people to figure out, as a community, what the right way to do it and what the wrong way to do it is. And all of these observations are not actually about specific applications. It's not as you build an application, you start to see similarities. It's across many different applications. There are similarities that experienced developers know, that you notice when you build multiple applications, and that the community starts to develop as a community that's building using something like Angular. So clearly, I think we can observe that there is some kind of notion of the right way to do it that goes beyond just the pure raw base that something like Angular or Backbone gives you. You could think maybe that's the top. That, you know, Angular is the exact point at which you stop having similarities, and that's why you have to build a framework on top of it. But we can see that there are some similarities, there are some best practices, and some bad practices that Angular doesn't really offer any guidance on as an API.
So again, this is the Angular tagline. AngularJS is a tool set for building the framework most suited to your application's development. And basically, this is saying the opposite. It's saying that you should build, to channel Dave Morin, you should build a custom, bespoke, handcrafted, one-of-a-time framework every time you're building a new app. But I think the important thing to recognize as what I believe is cognitive dissonance here is that if you can build a framework every single time, and yet there's all this wisdom floating around about how the best way to structure and build your app is. Those things don't match up. Not everyone should build their own framework if there's a generally accepted set of best practices that if someone were to come and look at your code base and saw you doing wrong, would think that you were a poor developer.
So fundamentally, whenever you build an application, whether you build it using a framework or whether you build it using a tool set or whether you build it using a library, you're building a bunch of modules. You're building a large number of modules. And you're putting them together to form an application. And one thing that happens, no matter whether you're using a framework or a library or a tool set, is that you get clusters of objects that represent different roles in the system. So you get controllers, you get templates, you get in Ember filters and Angular Ember helpers and Angular filters, right? You get clusters of objects that represent different roles. And what tends to happen is that one of the kinds of best practice, one of the kinds of wisdom is which of these kinds of objects should normally have access to what other kinds of objects and in what situations. So really what a framework is all about is taking these kinds of best practices, taking this knowledge about what kinds of objects should generally have access to what other kinds of objects, and communicating them emotionally through code. They're about making the best practices feel better than bad practices. Bad practices should feel bad. Best practices should feel good. And here's an example of sort of the Ember idea. So the Ember is a framework, and Ember says that the answer to this question is data flows from the route to the controller to the template into individual components, and actions flow back out from components to templates to controller to route. This is one way that you might structure an application. I think people write Angular applications like this as well. And importantly, because you cannot inject route params directly into components, the route is actually forced to convert the URL into the model asynchronously. And what this means is that if you want to know how am I going from an ID in the URL into a model object, in an Ember app, you always know exactly where that's happening, because Ember has said this is the role of the route. It's to convert the ID into a model, and it's also said this is the role of the route, and you can't do it somewhere else. It's basically going to be difficult to do somewhere else. And we're going to talk a little bit more on this later. And just one interesting anecdote is we've often seen examples where people make things like Angular tabs, and the Angular tab directives are like looking directly at the URL to figure out what thing to show or what not to show. And I think Angular developers will often tell us, like, this is not really the right practice. I think this is not going to end up being composable. And I think this sort of thing ends up being a place where Ember really shines. And sort of further, Tom and I both have worked on big monolithic frameworks. So I think at this point in the talk, you should be thinking to yourself, well, this all sounds good, but doesn't this just mean that you end up with one giant mass of a thing, and if you don't like exactly what Ember has given you, you're basically totally stuck? So Tom worked on the Sprout Core framework, and I worked on Rails, and admittedly, Sprout Core and Rails actually had this problem. We can see what goes wrong when the idea of providing guardrails goes too far. But really what we believe in is building an API that nudges you in the right direction on top of a maximally flexible primitive. So we believe in the maximally flexible primitive just like Angular does. We just believe that we should provide a higher level API on top that nudges you in the right direction, that makes it feel good to do the right thing.
So here's an example. Of basically punching through the conventions that Ember has put in place to guide you. So this is an example where you're saying, actually, I really want, in this case, I have a component, which is like an Angular directive called myfoo. I really, really, really want it to have access to information about the URL, about the route. You can do that. There's an underlying what we call a maximally flexible API under the hood powering the things. You can punch through. But I think when you look at it, you can see that it's very explicit about what you're doing, and you have to opt out of the guidance that Ember is providing for you. So it's possible to violate Ember's guidance, but it's a little bit explicit. It's very explicit, and it's, yes, I think we will admit, a little bit unpleasant. So I like to think of the role of a framework, if anyone's shot a firearm before, it's a little bit like the safety. It's just a little bit of friction to prevent you from blowing your leg off. So now that we talked about that, I want to get a little bit more concrete. Talk a little bit, give a few more examples. So the first example I want to talk about is components. And Angular directives are admittedly highly optimized for maximum flexibility in the primary public API. Nothing is more representative of that than the directive API. In practice, the only meaningful differences you see in well-built Angular directives that are representing components are trivial variations on this basic theme over here. So you have a directive, it returns a hash that basically creates an isolated scope, sets some attributes through, accepts transclusions if necessary, and restricts to element or maybe something else. What we noticed with Ember is that we wanted to implement components, and we looked at the Angular directive API, and we discovered that most of the time, people are trying to build components with this API, and there's a particular set of best practices that everyone in the Angular community agrees is correct. So we said, we're not going to make you tune a flexible API to get the thing that everyone usually wants. We're going to give you an API that does the right thing out of the box. So Ember components are totally isolated. They support transcluding content by default. They support sending events through the boundary by default. And by using Ember in the regular way, in the normal way, you get the right behavior.
And as before, if it turns out that this isn't exactly what you want, if you want more power, there's a maximally flexible primitive underneath called ember.view. But if you use it, you know you're doing something weird. You know you're explicitly dropping out of best practice zone. So again, if you use a component, it feels good. You're doing the right thing. You're doing something that everyone agrees is good, is a best practice. And if you need the flexibility, you can do it, but it feels bad on purpose.
So I think if you've heard about Ember, probably one of the things you've heard about it is that it has a really good router. But if you've heard router in other frameworks, if that's your context for what a router is, you probably think of it, oh, it's just like this translation layer. It's basically just like a URL translation layer. It's responsible for basically getting your objects up and running. And I'm sorry, in other frameworks, it's basically this thing that like looks at the URL and tries to figure out what template to put on screen, or it calls a callback. But in Ember, the router is the core piece. No one says, actually, the Ember router isn't that good, but it's modular, so I'm going to pull it out and use a community effort. That just doesn't happen. In Ember, the router is the heart and soul. It is responsible for setting up and wiring up all of these different objects based on what the current URL is. And I think in a lot of ways, Ember is the router, and the router is Ember.
So when we started with Ember, really Ember 2 or 3 years ago looked a lot like what React.js is right now. The first version of Ember was really just extracting the view layer out of Sprout Core and templating it up, making it more templatey. But in our first apps that we built with that version of Ember, we discovered that the community really struggled with how to instantiate objects and how to give them access to one another. We considered the Angular approach at the beginning, which is basically to punt the problem to developers and declare victory. We basically say it's too domain specific. Basically, everyone should just decide. You make a bootstrapping file, or you declare your dependencies in a dependency injection system, and you just decide what objects should have access to what other objects based on whatever your application does. But the more we actually looked at actual applications, the more we saw the same patterns repeated over and over and over.
So the goal of the first release of the current router was basically to establish a few simple roles. So routes get converted into models, they get plugged into a controller, and that powers a render template. And this is actually really important because this is the point in the history of Ember where the community really started to take off. Finally, as a community, we had a shared set of vocabulary for defining this kind of set of hard problems that everyone together was trying to solve.
Now, once we've had the idea of loading a model for a particular template, right, everybody in Ember builds applications that have the concept of loading a model for this template. And that's how you build an Ember application. We were able to start extending it simply and easily with additional functionality that requires no new boilerplate. And one example of this is a loading or error state. So if you're in the middle of loading a model for a particular template, what happens if the model is in the middle of loading? It's asynchronous, and you're waiting for it to load. So we were able to make it really easy, and here's the code. We were able to make it really easy to just say, if your model's in the middle of loading, you create a template called loading, and we will use that instead of the model, instead of the template that will eventually show when the model actually shows. And the only way that you can actually achieve this kind of thing is by having some shared vocabulary, having the notion of, in every Ember application, first you get the URL, you convert it into a model which loads asynchronously, and then eventually you render a template with that model. And that gives you a space to slot in the loading template. It gives you a space to say, what happens if there's an error? Where do you put the error information, right? And every time you look at an example like this, I think people say, oh, that's a lot less code. But where did the code go? We're not magicians. We can't just remove code. The place that the code went is, the way we're able to remove the code is because we have shared vocabulary and shared structure that everyone agrees to. So you don't have to write the code that says, oh, I'm in the middle of loading a model, and let me go look at this template. I happen to know that this template is going to eventually be the place where this model goes. That's basically what everyone ends up doing. Now,
why are there no slides on the?
Well, they like keep popping in back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the code example probably could have used some the code. I don't think. Did anyone see the code example when we were talking about it? Yeah. Okay. Sweet.
Awesome. Yeah.
I just want to call out. We've put a link at the bottom. You can check out the loading state and the error state. We've got URLs. We are relying on conference Wi-Fi to demonstrate the loading state, and we're also relying on GitHub's API rate limits to demonstrate the errors.
So another feature, so now that we have this idea of a model comes in from the URL, gets loaded asynchronously, gets put into a template, and by the way, if it's loading, you can use a loading template, and if it's an error, there's an error template, and under the hood, there's all these flexible primitives that have events that you can use to do other behavior if you want to do something special with loading. right? Another thing that people really started to talk about was they wanted query param support. And the first versions of query params were basically plugins for the Ember Router. So again, people don't swap out the Ember Router, they plug into the Ember Router. And people built in additional functionality for query params on top of our maximally flexible primitives. But the more
so basically, we quickly noticed that because there was a shared notion of application structure and this flow, we could actually do much better. So in the final version of the query params feature, which you can find on Ember's Canary channel, is basically it builds on the shared structure, and it maps query parameters onto the properties of active controllers in the same way that the original router established this way that the model enters the system. This feature establishes how controller properties can be stored in the URL and shared. And this is actually a slide from a talk that we've given many, many times before. And we really spend a lot of time thinking about how this structure, the roles and the objects in the system, map onto the URL. And I think this really demonstrates that when the community gets on the same page about how we build the applications, we can start to build higher level functionality on top of that shared understanding. And this is the kind of thing that you simply can't do when all you have is the maximally flexible primitives. So I think if we were to define what a flexible API is, I would say that it's an API that makes doing the wrong thing feel just as good as doing the right thing. Using the maximally flexible API as a primary public API offers no way to kind of continue to evolve functionality on top of these well-defined roles. And because there are none outside of scattered best practices documents, and you can't really build a library out of best practice documents. So if your first instinct when you're building a tool or when you're using a tool is, oh my God, this is so flexible, this is awesome, really what you should be asking yourself is, what mistakes am I making right now that I'm going to be regretting in 6 months or a year?
Now, in contrast, what is a framework? So a framework makes doing the right thing feel good and the wrong thing feel bad. A framework, a good framework, is built on top of maximally flexible primitives that you can always drop down to should you need the additional flexibility. A framework evolves with the best practices of the community, so as the community learns what is the right thing, the framework gains some emotional clues about whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing over time. And finally, really what a framework does is it nurtures a feedback loop that helps features to iterate as the shared understanding develops. So over time, a shared understanding gets developed in any community, in Angular, in Backbone, in Ember. And as the shared understanding develops, a framework looks to pull that shared understanding into the best practices of the framework, how the framework makes you feel. So
basically we said, OK, given that this is what we think the definition of a framework is, let's kind of just review the list of frameworks in the JavaScript ecosystem. So there's Ember and Bueller. There's really nothing else. No one else in the JavaScript community wants to identify as a framework, so everyone has avoided taking on that responsibility. And a responsibility, indeed, is what it is.
And I think fundamentally, we are not embarrassed to be a framework. And we're not embarrassed. We're excited by the possibilities of what we can do when an entire community shares knowledge and encodes it into the DNA of the framework. So if you're ready to stop going it alone and join a community that values making the right way feel right, use Ember. You won't regret it.
Thank you very much.